of the failure of leadership behind the door?
He had no idea what he was doing.
If this is the standard of our leaders today, we're in trouble.
So, what kind of leader are you aiming to be?
Holy mackerel, how'd you do that?
Good leaders remember they are people first.
Leadership is hard.
Let me name those three things in a succinct way now.
We're taking leadership to a better place. Thank you for being with us on the Leadership Listening podcast.
Strategy is all about competitive differentiation. There's lots of other things you could say it's about, but I don't believe that. Competitive differentiation is just increasingly difficult to establish nowadays, but it needs to be done.
Today's Leadership Listening guest is Chris Outram, Chairman Emeritus of OC&C Strategy Consultants, and Chris is the O in OC&C. And Chris has had over 30 years of strategy consulting at board level in the US and also in Europe. Corporate strategy, divisional performance, mergers and acquisitions, and organizational advice are all part of his offer in the world of strategy. Sparing Chris's blushes, he's one of the high priests of strategy consulting, who is also chairman of the Champions of Change for United World Schools, a charity dedicated to getting out of school children around the world into school. So Chris, welcome, and let's get into leadership listening. Your early life, education, university, a couple of 3 minutes on that.
Well, thank you very much. It's a little bit complicated, largely because my parents were in the Royal Air Force, and therefore they travelled a lot, and we travelled a lot. And my brother, who was 5 years older than myself, and myself, were stuffed into a boarding school in Lincolnshire. It was a good school, but it was pretty unexciting. So when I read an advert put up by our local council advertising a scholarship to a place called Atlantic College, which was an international sixth form college whose claim to fame was it combined academia with physical exercise, I thought this was rather good news. And given that it was in a castle on the coast of Wales and the Bristol Channel, it was also spectacular in terms of its location. So I went there, spent a couple of wonderful years, but it did mean I spent 3 years in my sixth form, not 2. But it did allow me to not only do the 3 science A-levels that I was doing, but I added economics to that, which was an increasing passion. And I managed to do that A-level in 4 months, and actually got the highest grade out of all my A-levels in something I did in 4 months. I then went to university, but that was a bit complicated as well, because my parents wanted me to do engineering, like my brother. But of course, I didn't want to do that at all. I really wanted to do economics. So I looked around the UK and found the only university that would allow me to simultaneously read 2 degrees, one in mechanical engineering and one in industrial economics. So I went there, and I'm pleased to say it was a very good investment, in the sense that I came out, and this sounds a little bit self-aggrandizing, which I apologize for. I got a double first and the economics prize and the engineering prize. So it worked out pretty well. I then went on to my first job, which was a very good job with the Mobil Oil Company, which was quite a peach of a job in those days. But sadly, in the 6-month induction period, we fell out badly about where they were going to put me. And they wanted me to build a computer model of the Coryton refinery. And the last thing I wanted to do in the world was spend 18 months building a computer model of the current refinery. So we parted ways. I joined Air Products, became a management accountant, which was terrific. Then joined a company called CCL Systems, which was a small company, subsidiary of a big company. I won't go into detail of that. And at that stage, I got the call to go to INSEAD. And when I say call, it was a call in the sense that I'd applied to INSEAD Business School every year since I left university. And in this final year, they said, if you don't come this year, we're going to rip up your application form. So I went, which is where I discovered strategy consulting. I joined the Boston Consulting Group, where I spent a couple of years. I then went to one of our clients as head of strategy, and they were based in the Netherlands. That was fabulous experience. But they were on their fourth CEO in 18 months, and I decided this wasn't going in the right way. So I came back to UK. It was a recession in 1981, so I had to go back into consulting, which in principle I didn't want to do. So I did it with Booz Allen and Hamilton. I didn't like it after a year. So I determined that either they would fire me at some stage or make me a partner, and one way or the other I would wait for one of those two events. Luckily, in 1981, they did make me a partner. So I immediately left and started up OC&C Strategy Consultants as one of the world's only specialist strategy consultancies, and we don't do anything different. We just do the high-end stuff. And it seems to have gone all right, Lawrie, I have to say. We've now got 700 consultants worldwide, over 900 employees, 15 offices in 11 countries. And we will do this year somewhere over 200 million quid. So going okay so far.
Pretty impressive. And when you say high-end strategy,
yes,
how's high-end strategy defined?
In principle, this is going to sound a little bit, again, self-aggrandizement corporately. We only employ extraordinarily talented people. So if you've got a first-class degree, that's okay, but it's not enough. You've got to have done something outside your degree arena, being president of the union or captain of the rowing or something which shows you've got breadth. And these people can be employed on the most complex strategy work. And that work tends to be for big companies with many divisions and operating in many different countries. So it tends to be, we work mostly for the larger companies in the world. More recently, we've added private equity to that list of client groups. And those are the sort of companies that have got complex strategy, which we're really good at. And so that's what I mean by high end.
If we look at times gone by, then naturally the pace of the world has been increasing steadily. I think it's fair to say it's about to enter a phase where it accelerates enormously quickly. And against that background, if we look at strategy, how's it changed over the last 10 years? And what do you think it's going to look like as we go forward with this greater rapidity?
Yes, well, I have to say you're absolutely right. When I joined strategy consulting with BCG back in 1977, there were really, strategy was all about really big things. Did you go left or did you go right, as opposed to minor changes of direction? And it was very new. And the tools with which we did it were really fundamental. There weren't any laptops in those days. We didn't have fax. There was no email. And frankly, we were doing everything on calculators and telex, which makes my mind boggle nowadays as to how we got anything done. But anyway, the big changes are that there's a huge amount of data in the world now. And the second thing, that data is readily available within seconds, if not minutes. So suddenly, if a company does something, their competitor will know about it within hours or days. So everything has moved more rapidly, which means that if you got me onto the definition of strategy, I would say strategy is all about competitive differentiation. There's lots of other things you could say it's about, but I don't believe that. I think it's all about competitive differentiation. And the competitive differentiation is just increasingly difficult to establish nowadays, but it needs to be done. Secondly, the thing that has therefore changed is the speed of reaction of your competitors, as I just mentioned. And secondly, that implication is that your strategy longevity is relatively short. And you need to admit that and have processes, which we'll talk about a little bit later, which will deal with the fact that strategy is relatively short-lived, or can be. And then the final thing, which I think has changed, is the team issues around talents and capabilities. Again, when I started strategy was a board issue generally, but really it was devolved to the CEO, and actually the CEO devolved it to his top management team. And frankly, that's changed. It is now the CEO needs to own the strategy. It isn't just he needs to manage the process of getting it. It needs to be his, because as we know, CEOs are now relatively short-lived as well. And if the strategy isn't good, the board takes a judgment that maybe they need to get somebody who can bring a good strategy to the company. So the committee team is starts with the CEO, frankly, downwards. And the other observation I would make, and it's one that's always been true, but limited by the technology available, is the devil is in the detail. You can't just wave your arms around and say, my strategy is X. You really need to go into a lot of detail about yourself, your competitors, the sources of competitive advantage, which require you to do stunningly detailed work country by country in terms of the cost of both your competitors, but also yourself, and what both of you can do about it. So the devil is in the detail, which and that, funnily enough, hasn't changed. A lot of other things have changed, but the fact that the devil's in the detail hasn't changed.
That's terrific, Chris. When I'm having conversations with clients these days, my reckoning is you can look forward a year, you can look forward 2 years, but almost certainly in my book, no more than 3 years. So how does your work in the strategy field look from a time horizon as it presently stands, and what's going to happen as life gets so much faster from a strategy point of view?
The world is indeed a lot more complicated than it used to be. And secondly, the speed with which you can get information and process it is again accelerating quite rapidly. However, the markets, and we're talking the stock markets, investor markets generally, still have roughly the same time scale expectations. They still want to see long-term performance. They want to see growing profits. They want to see general growth over and above stability. And that means that you still need to look to the long term to make sure that your strategy makes long-term sense. However, given the fact that things are moving very quickly, I think what that means is that you need to respond with processes that deal with the fact that things change. And in my opinion, what that means is that the CEO, as I've said already, needs to own the strategy. It's not somebody else's strategy, it's his strategy and the board's strategy. And I think it would be wise for the CEO every 6 months to get together two groups of people. One to probably not his immediate reports, but perhaps people who report to them, to get together in a two-day workshop and just review what strategy is and how it's working. And is there any major change? And that's particularly important competitively. Is there any competitor that's broke ranks and is doing something different and more successfully? And if so, why? What is it that's changed? And should we be worried about that change? Can we emulate that change, or is there nothing we can do about it? So that's something one should do, I think, every 6 months. And the result of that process will be either, oh, everything's all right, it's a slight blip, all the way through to, oh my goodness me, there has been a fundamental change competitively or in the markets, and we need to change our strategy. We need to repeat the strategy process. So that's one thing I would do. The second group that I would have every 6 months is probably really the head of group HR. But as long as you trust them, some HR at that level is just a process job. But what I'm talking about is somebody who really knows the leadership of the company 2 or 3 levels down, who's doing well, who's not doing well, why aren't they doing well, etc., etc. And I would also not just review the strategy, but I'd also review the team implementing that strategy. And again, if changes need to be made, that would be entirely appropriate to make those changes. So, yes, things are moving fast, but I think you can put in process things which will help you manage those changes.
And I'm interested as well, Chris, in what happens when strategy goes wrong. Is it more a case of poor analysis, or is it weak commitment, or is it just poor execution?
Yes, I saw your question and the 3 things: poor analysis, poor commitment, or poor execution. And I thought about those really, really hard. And the first one, poor analysis, I would have to expand and say poor analysis and design. And we came across poor analysis and design mostly in very large companies that had its own strategy department. Now, that sounds a bit strange. You would expect big companies to have their own strategy department, and that would serve them well. Our experience is that that's not the case. Strategy shouldn't be done on a weekly basis. So having a department actually employed to do strategy. I'm not sure what they do after having defined strategy in a 3-month or 4-month process. And secondly, our experience is that not all the time, but quite often, strategy departments are not staffed by the brightest, most dynamic and wonderful individuals, largely because CEOs quite rightly put them in charge of businesses. But they tend to be employing possibly people at the end of their career, or perhaps don't know what to do with them at the moment, etc. So let's put them in the strategy department for a year or two, etc., etc. And you haven't got cutting edge thinkers, and therefore poor analysis and design we can come across, and it tends to be in big companies with those sort of less than perfect strategy departments.
Interesting, just to pause here, Chris, on the notion that the chief execs that I've dealt with, in the ideal sense, need to be visionaries, need to be analysts, and need to be implementers. And of course, if you can find one that has 33% of each of those, you're in luck. Very often, they're dominant in one of those three things: visionary, analyst, implementer. What do you see through the strategy lens against that triptych?
Well, I agree with you, Lawrie, that the combination of those three things is ideal. It is very difficult to find people who are, one third, one third, one third, and you can. What you can do is probably replace the first of those three from time to time, and just do great analysis and great thinking, and subcontract that. You can't subcontract the other two, frankly. Those are the core, in my opinion, of a good CEO. What you need in terms of the first one is that the CEO recognizes his weakness and knows how to fix it, and goes out to the right people, gets the right advice from the right people, etc., etc. But the other two, you can't subcontract. As I said, they're critical to the job of the CEO.
And it's often said.
Let me just complete this question, because you also talked about weak commitment and weak execution as being one of the downfalls of strategy. I have to say, my view here is that these are two sides of the same coin. That if you've got poor commitment, you get poor execution almost by definition. And if you've got poor execution, you've definitely got poor commitment, again, almost by definition. And, I touched on this, and this is a bit of self-publicity, on a book that I wrote, must be 10 years ago, called Making Your Strategy Work, where I interviewed 65 chief executives and came up with a whole list of issues which meant that strategy didn't quite work out. And there are 9 of them. I'm just going to very briefly read those 9, and you can always edit this out if you feel not appropriate. But the first one was short-termism, i.e., you only look a year ahead rather than 3 to 5 years ahead, because there, as I said earlier, there is a reason to look 3 to 5 years out, even though you've got to be very responsive in the short term. Second is excessive introspection. And what I mean by that is not spending enough time worrying about competitors and what their source of advantage is. and that leads you down very bad roads. Overconfidence, clearly not very sensible. Short-sightedness, that we're really not seeing the limitations of what we've got. Tolerance of mediocrity. It is horrible to have to say to somebody, "I'm terribly sorry. Your time with the company really has come to an end, and you've done a great job, but I need something slightly different." That's very difficult, and many people do fail on that and tolerate people for too long. Loss of focus, i.e., we could do this because it's very close to our existing business. Yes, but on the other hand, it's a dangerous way to go. And you mentioned United World Schools, and where we build a school in a very remote place, serving 120 primary school children. A lot of people have said to us, "Oh, well, once you have got that school, you could also help with the community health and all sorts of things." And I always said, no, we are good at education. That's where we really make a difference. There must be other people good at health. If they wish to use our infrastructure, that's great. It's available. But we're not going into health. And that's an example of where focus issues. And during these interviews, I had to add 2 or 3 new ones to my original list, which was the list of 6 I've just mentioned. One of which, inconsistency and disbelief in the top team. So you've got to have the commitment of the top team. They've got to understand the strategy. They've got to understand why it has been chosen by the CEO, and they've got to believe in it. And if they don't, they're never going to implement it properly.
It's an expression I use these days, Chris, which is that teams need to get match fit, rather like a tennis player or whatever. And quite often they're not match fit and not doing the stuff that they need to in order to become match fit.
No, I agree entirely. But if you don't have belief across your top management team, you will not get the result you want. And the next one is around that result, which is I think companies are very poor at stating their real purpose. And the purpose for a corporation could be all sorts of things. It could be a set of values. It could be a set of goals, either financial or influencing other things. And they're very poor at establishing what success looks like. And I think more time could be spent on that. And then, as we have been talking about already, I don't need to repeat it in great detail, lack of pace. That once you decide to do something, you should do it as fast as reasonable. And sometimes as fast as unreasonable.
So an interesting clutch there. And I particularly like the mediocrity one, Chris, because there's a wonderful saying by Somerset Maugham, which is only the mediocre are always at their best. So have a thought about that.
Indeed.
If we're thinking about uncomfortable truths, because I think there's a sort of fair piece of understanding that people are naturally shy of change. The as-is position is quite attractive and so on. But what uncomfortable truth do clients need to hear somewhat more often?
I think the 2 big ones, if I was the board, the 2 things that I probably don't hear enough about, board meetings, you have how's the company doing financially. Then you have a whole series of topics like, should we go into China, or what are we going to do about X, etc. And I think the 2 things that I would like boards to spend a bit more time on when they meet is whether the strategy, number one, whether the strategy is working. And they ought to be able to talk to the CEO of whether it's working, why it's working, and if it's not working somewhere, why. Because that's really critical, in my opinion, because the board can't deal with many short-term topics. That's the role of the CEO. But they should be focused on whether the strategy is working or not. And I very seldom see that on the board agenda. The second thing is whether the team that the CEO has put in place is actually working or not. And that, as I said, requires a very insightful head of HR who understands the top team and can say, yes, by and large, it's working pretty well. However, Jack in Indonesia seems to be struggling in this way and that way. And, we need to think about how to help with that. So, in my opinion, Lawrie, I think boards should insist on hearing about both of these topics at a quarterly board meeting. And there are lots of topics on their agenda which, frankly, I can't do much about because they really are the remit of the CEO. That is something I think I would spend a bit of time talking to boards about.
Okay, and if ownership of strategy is important, Chris, are you seeing much evidence along the way that boards and executive teams are reluctant to move away from a strategy that isn't working?
Yes, on these two topics, both the strategy, which is maybe not working, and people who may not be working out, both of those are very uncomfortable in terms of how do you then deal with them. But I think, if a board is a representative of the shareholders, which it is, then the boards should be willing to pick up this sort of responsibility of saying to the CEO, it really isn't working, you've got to fix it. And if it isn't fixed in a period of time, we'll have to make our own judgment. Or, if you're not dealing with Jack in Indonesia in a sensible way, either reinforcing his skills or replacing him, then, that's what the boards are for, frankly.
Holding everything to account.
Absolutely.
We've got the advent now of artificial intelligence, which is many things to many people in many different types of organization, and is going to show itself a lot more as time passes. How does strategy sit relative to the onset of this complex artificial intelligence perspective?
The AI issue, of course, is really critical. And there's absolutely no doubt that it will affect our work and the work of development of strategy generally. But for our work, most of our strategy is for big companies, multi-business, multi-geography, multi-product, complex organizations. And if we look at the sequence in which AI will impact those things, I think the first thing, and it's already happening, and we have groups of people doing AI type work, it's in the area of research, market data, competitive data, etc., etc. You can connect globally a huge amount of information and process it very, very quickly indeed. It all needs checking, but at least you get a template very, very quickly. The next area where I think AI will have an impact, but it probably will take 12, 18 months, is in the arena of what I call hypotheses. Strategy work that we do is all hypothesis based, namely because you can't look at every single opportunity. It would take months, if not years, to do that. You have to have a hypothesis and then test the hypothesis around competitive advantage, market attractiveness, et cetera, and where necessary, change it and then come up with a new hypothesis. I think AI will ultimately begin to have an impact on that process, but it's a little way off. Firstly, because I'm not sure that we are that good at taking different inputs of that nature. And secondly, I think it's because it's so complex, hypothesis creation, it may take a little while to build the AI models that will actually do it. And the third area and I think this is definitely beyond a couple of years, is actually for AI to come up with recommended complex solutions. Because the solutions that we come up with are, I believe, quite complicated, even though the final report is very short and very clear. The information behind that is hugely complicated around cost structures, competitive capabilities and action, organization changes, even down to how do individual CEOs work. I mean, how does the competitor CEO work and what does that mean? And that will, I think, when you add all that up, that is very complex. And I think that will take a little while for AI to make a real impact, if indeed it ever does. We'll just have to see. I think many say that AI will probably impact faster than that. I think that I don't agree. I believe that the fact is that good strategy is a result of very complex, multifaceted thinking, is going to remain the case for some time. Even though, frankly, once you've done all this work for 6 months, you've got the strategy into a 30-page presentation, the CEO needs to make it into a 2-sentence strategy that he can talk to somebody about in the lift. But the simplicity of it being down to 2 sentences can only be done as a result of a massive amount of complicated work.
Are you always looking, Chris, for first mover advantage, or is the follower a better thing to look out for? And how do you work out which one you need to be?
Yes, well, it's an interesting one. Most of our clients are in businesses, frankly, which they've been in for quite some time. And going back in history to try and find out whether they were the first mover or not can be quite complicated. I think what I would say is there is definitely an advantage in being first mover. And if you can come across something before everybody else does, of course that has an advantage. I think more importantly is defining competitive advantage and hopefully building barriers around that competitive advantage that are difficult for competitors to take apart. I mean, the most obvious one is in mining. If you buy a mine which has got a unique mineral in, you got the quintessential competitive advantage. But very few businesses are quite like that. And it's more subtle. You may have the biggest factory with the lowest cost, which is a great advantage. But if design comes along and is superior, and unfortunately you can't make it in your low-cost factory, that's a relatively short-lived competitive advantage. So actually understanding competitive advantage is the fundamental, in my opinion, of good strategy work.
And of course, Charlie Munger, who was Warren Buffett's number two, spoke fondly of organizations having a moat. Do you want to say a little bit about moats and whether that's still relevant in your thinking, Chris?
Well, define for me quickly what you believe a moat is.
Well, my reckoning of a moat is that defensive, if you like, capability, which is of a certain time frame, a certain technological complexity, or whatever, which means that anybody who wanted to attack you is going to have to deal with the moat. So organizations then having a consciousness of the moat and what kind of qualities and quantities the moat has, which gives them that defensive ability.
Yes. No, I think we're on the same page. I think competitive advantage is what I would call a moat. Namely, if you genuinely can demonstrate that you have an advantage over your competitors and they are going to find it difficult to replicate, then that is a true competitive advantage. And the longer you can sustain that, the better. And it can, as I say, be a low-cost factory. It could be access to raw materials, which others don't have. It could be relationships with distributors and marketeers in the countries in which you're operating, and that they love you to death and they don't love the competitors. Or it could be that you're just good at design and updating that design over a period of time. And a number of companies are capable of doing that. So having a moat or a competitive advantage is critical to strategy. Knowing what that is and how to sustain it is all about the longevity of the strategy and how quickly you have to replace that strategy in the event that the competitive advantage is fragile.
And if we look at strategic risks in this volatile day and age, Chris, what are the risks that boards systematically underweight today?
Well, I think the last 15 months have demonstrated perhaps the biggest one, which most people did not expect, which is geopolitical uncertainty. Mr. Trump has managed to pull up most geopolitical plants by their roots. And frankly, it's knowing how to interpret that is absolutely critical. And even the last week, we've seen a tariff regime where we thought we knew what it looked like suddenly disappear, and a totally new tariff regime be put in place. And who knows how long that will last. And so geopolitical uncertainty is now top of the list of things that I think boards and CEOs need to worry about and react to. But they're not the only. It's not the only one. I think the others that I would mention, I've also mentioned already, is one, competitors. I'm not sure that most boards spend enough time worrying about competitors, what they're doing, and whether they're doing better than us, and if so, why. Can we emulate that? Can we undermine it? Whatever it is. But competitors is a really critical issue. People, we've mentioned a number of times already, getting the right team with the right talents, capabilities, and motivation is absolutely critical, and is sometimes underweight in those discussions at board level. The real meaning of competitive advantage. I'm not sure if you walked into many boardrooms and said, "Okay, what is the competitive advantage of your business?" That they would really be able to give you a credible and detailed answer. And then the final one we mentioned a number of times: speed, the ability to act at pace. And those things, again, I think all of those are slightly underweight. They, in most discussions, not all discussions, by the way, but many discussions underweight those issues.
And if we look then specifically at the world where we first met, financial and professional services, seems to me that down in the lower end of those kind of organizations in particular, then technology and artificial intelligence and so on is going to have its most prolific effect and commoditize, if you like, work that goes on, particularly at the bottom end of those organizations. So are clients underestimating that impact and how quickly it's going to take effect?
Yeah, probably is the answer. And I agree with you entirely, Lawrie. I think some of the more mechanical processes at the low end of the professional services arena of products will definitely migrate very rapidly to AI solutions of one sort or another. And when you think of some of the we're both being close to audit products. Audit in principle is a very simple process. You check some numbers, and then you check how those numbers have been put together, and then check whether the answers that have come up make sense. And some of that, I could imagine quite a lot of that is prone to AI substitution in some way, shape, or form. So I think the smart professional services companies are already thinking 2 years ahead and saying, what is our organization going to look like?
And if I look way back in time, Chris, at people who were like Alvin Toffler, futurologists, people who wrote about the future. Fascinating to look back and see which ones of them got it right. But do firms like OC&C then have people inside who are under the heading futurologist, blue sky thinkers, whatever you want to say about that, or is it just an analytic process for whatever strategic client comes along?
The simple question is answered by a simple answer, which is no. We don't have futurologists in the organization, largely because a futurologist needs to be connected with the world in a way that we aren't necessarily connected to the world, because they need lots of different inputs, etc., etc. Do we listen to futurologists? Yes, a lot. There are futurologists who've got a lot of facts on their side, and there are futurologists who just wave their arms around a lot. We like the ones with facts behind them, and we listen very, very hard to their rationale for why the world's changing and the data behind that in terms of what that change will do for the strategy of our client. So futurology is important, but it's the fact-based futurology which is much more important. I mean, a good example of this is the debate in the States at the moment about climate change, where the futurologists that are in vogue are arm wavers and don't have any facts as far as one can see. Whereas all those people who have got facts about temperature changes and ice, glaciers melting, etc., are being ignored. So, well, we prefer the ones with data.
Interesting, Chris, because I was watching a Davos conversation recently between the head of Google AI
Right.
and the head of Anthropic AI.
Oh,
And
right.
interestingly, for two very significant heavyweights, the final part of their conversation had them in complete agreement. And the complete agreement was that we genuinely really wish all this that we were doing was going slower, because society and business will just not be able to keep up with the pace of what we are bringing to the world. We have to have that pace because of our shareholders. We have to have that pace because we're competing against the Chinese. So heavyweight advice from them about a world that is going to not be ready for what's coming.
Oh, well, I totally sympathise with their point of view. But we always knew that this was coming. If I go back 20, 30 years, we all knew the graphs of increasing innovation, increasing speeds of things. Just everything was a massively upwards pointing graph, which says, "Oh my God, so much is going to change." And I think that is what is happening, and it will accelerate. And whether society can absorb that in the right way, I very much doubt. And therefore, sadly, it depends on leadership, both corporate leadership, but also political leadership, as to how you interpret the choices that you have and how best you balance those choices with the best possible outcome, even though you can't guarantee that outcome.
And is finally, as we come to the end of our conversation, Chris, do you think leadership is keeping up with things these days, or are you a bit more disappointed with it, hopeful for it in the future, whatever?
Well, I think you'd have to differentiate political leadership from corporate leadership, because the geopolitical, as we've said earlier, the geopolitical landscape is changing stunningly fast, frankly, and unpredictably fast. And I'm not capable at this stage of really saying that will improve or get worse. Corporate leadership, I have to say, I believe that the processes that put good leaders at the top of corporations are somewhat more robust than some of the political processes. So I'm much more optimistic that corporations will be able to deal with complexity than the political environment can deal with it.
Good stuff. Well, we always close, Chris, with two headlines: your pet hate and your secret passion. What have you got on offer?
I did think about this a little bit, because you did warn me slightly. I think my pet hate is a rather strange one, which is my pet hate is grumpy, impolite people. And it's a pet hate because nobody needs to be grumpy or impolite. You can actually have much more constructive and enjoyable interactions with people by just thinking hard about how you're coming across and what outcome is likely to be the result of how you're behaving. So that's my pet hate. Pet passions, secret passions. Well, the first one will come as well, maybe it won't come as a surprise, but it might come as a surprise. And the answer is ice cream. I love ice cream. And the second one is family. I love Stephanie. I love my daughters. I love their partners. I love their grandchildren. And the grandchildren bit of it combines so well with the first of my secret passions, ice cream, that I'm able to fulfill both a pleasurable interaction with my grandchildren with an indulgence of my secret passion. So
Fabulous. Thank you, Chris. And thank you for a very, very interesting tour d'horizon of the world of strategy. I hope listeners will really value what they've heard. And if they've got things to say, then they can contact us by email on podcast@leadershiplistening.com. But for now, thank you, Chris, for your time today. Bye for now.
thank you, Lawrie. I've really enjoyed it.